Hello and welcome to ADTV, and today we've come down to our local river to hopefully talk you through some very simple stick float fishing tactics. Now, if you've never been out before and done stick float fishing on the river, it can be one of the best ways to enjoy a day's fishing. It's so exciting watching that float trot away from you, slide under, and then you're into that fish, and hopefully we're going to be catching a few of those. So if you haven't done it before, this video is hopefully going to talk you through what you need and the bare essentials to get yourself into a stick float fishing session. So first of all, we'll talk about the tackle that we need. Now, I would always start off, if you've not done it before, with a fixed spool reel and a 13-foot rod. The reason for the 13-foot rod is because it helps us keep in contact with the float and it helps us mend the line, which we'll talk to you a little bit about in a moment. And the fixed spool reel is just purely for ease of use. They're much easier to use than the centre pin reels. If you watch a few other river fishing videos, centre pins are quite popular because they are good, but they are a little bit more tricky to use. So to start with, we'll go with a fixed spool reel and a 13-foot rod, and then that brings us down to the terminal tackle that we need for the session. Now, to keep things simple, Angling Direct, we've put some packs together online for everything you need for a day's stick float fishing, or failing that, pop into any of our stores. The staff are there really helpful. They'll be able to guide you in the right directions for everything you need for your day's fishing. And that brings us to exactly where we are today. We're on the bank ready to get it set up. So obviously the first thing we need to talk about is the stick float that we're going to use. Now, we use stick floats on the river rather than wagglers, mainly because with wagglers the line goes through the eye at the bottom of the float, which doesn't allow the line to keep on the surface layers. Now, with a stick float, you attach them through 3 rubbers, normally one at the top, one at the middle, one at the bottom, and it keeps the line on top of the water, which is exactly what you need in flowing water. Now, the size of those is pretty much only relevant to the venue or the river that you're fishing. So if your local river is a fast, turbulent flowing river, you're going to need a more buoyant or a bigger stick float than you would perhaps where we are today on a river's only sort of 2 or 3 foot deep and just slowly meandering through. So get your stick float adjusted to the size of the river you're fishing. Now, we need to shot that. Now, normally on each float they tell you how many shot that it takes, and the shotting pattern that I would use, there's obviously loads out there, but the one that's most effective for me, and it's a great starting point before you play around with it yourself, is the shirt button style. Now, literally, as the name suggests, the buttons on a shirt are evenly spaced out. So you do that with your shot. Pretty much when you float to your hook, you space those out evenly, and that will be a perfect way to present your bait. And what that does is it creates a lovely natural fall, and you try and make basically your hook bait as natural as you can to the freebies that you're offering into the swim as well, and hopefully that'll be getting you many more bites throughout the session. And in the hooks, we've gone for hooks to nylon. You literally loop to loop those onto your main line, and then you are ready and set up for your session. So obviously the next thing to touch on is where you're going to fish. Now, in the river, obviously it's never just a straight line. There's always corners, trees hanging over, snags and stuff like that, but it's not always the best place to fish those areas, because you want to get a nice direct straight line so you can watch it for a long period of time and keep in contact with it. The easier or the straighter line you can flow that float on, the more bites you're going to catch. So the areas that you're looking for to start with stick float fishing are nice straight bits of river, snag free, and it just makes life so much better, and it really can offer the best days fishing. You don't always have to fish in the snaggy areas. So that's where we're going to fish. And then the next thing we're going to touch on is about how you put that float through the swim. Now, that might sound really simple to most people, and it is quite simple, but there's a couple of things you have to keep and bear in mind. So obviously when you're lake fishing, you can cast that float out, the shot will sink and your bait will settle where you cast. That's pretty simple. But on a river it's not quite like that. So obviously the flow is always trying to drag your line or your float off course. So the main thing to do, this is what I mentioned on earlier, is mend the line. What it means by that is you want to try and keep the line straight from your rod tip to your float as much as you can. You almost have to pick the line off the surface, mend it in an arc to keep that straight line. So that's what we call mending the line. And then obviously you need to keep in contact with that float. There's no point casting in, letting all the line float on the surface and create a big snake-like shape, because when you try and strike those bites, you're going to be picking up all that line before you actually make any contact. So the easiest way is to, once you've cast in, keep your bail arm open and just really gently put your finger on the spool and just let the weight of the float and the flow just peel from underneath your finger that line. So you're now keeping in direct contact with it, and you're keeping it all in a straight line. If you can get that mastered, it does take a bit of practice, you'll certainly be getting more bites on the river. And then the last thing I'm going to mention about is baits and how we feed them. So obviously there is so many baits, the list is literally endless on how or what you can fish with. But what we're after today is we're after some dace, some roach, perhaps some small species to get us into the sport. So what we're going to be using is maggots and perhaps some hemp, two baits that are perfect for those kind of fish, and will just get you literally action all day long. So we're going to be feeding those regularly and often. So we need to keep a steady trickle of bait going through the swim all the while. We can't just put loads in at once for two reasons. The fish obviously will eat them, so they'll disappear eventually, and the flow is constantly washing your bait out of your peg, so you need to keep a regular supply of bait going in, and that again will get you more bites. Now the last thing I'm going to touch on is where you feed that bait. And it's just as important as how often you feed it, because obviously if you're throwing the bait downstream of yourself, by the time that bait has sort of flowed naturally and settled on the bottom, that could be a long way away from you, and you don't want to be catching fish that far away from you. So as a general rule, I would say you'd feed those maggots slightly upstream of yourself or in front of yourself, and by the time they naturally fall and get to the bottom, they should be where you want to catch your fish. But you can judge that yourself. So if you find that you're catching fish absolutely miles away from you, it's probably because the flow of the river is taking your bait to that point before the fish intercept it on the bottom. So you might want to just feed that bait a little bit higher just to drag those fish towards you, and then you are all set, hopefully, for a brilliant day's fishing. Like I said, there's some action-packed stuff to be had here. You can catch loads of fish in a day, get absolutely loads of bites. So if you're into fishing and you've done it for ages, get out there and give it a go. Everyone loves this. Or if you're new to it and you want to get out there, hopefully what we've just discussed will put you on the right path to having some unbelievable days fishing on the river.